Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on wood markets retention and new market recruitment in New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. My name is Joe Short. I work with the Northern Forest Center, and I'm joined today by Charlie Levesque with the Northeast State Foresters Association and Innovative Natural Resource Solutions. And we're excited for this opportunity today to share with you the results of some work that Charlie and his colleagues have been doing over the last year to understand the current state of forests, markets for wood products, and new market opportunities in New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. And we'll get going here just after some quick introductory comments. For those of you not familiar, the Center is a regional not-for-profit organization. We work across the 4 northern forest states of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. As a regional innovation and investment partner focused on creating vibrant rural communities and healthy forest landscapes through programs that connect people, economy, and the forest landscape. I'm guessing to many, this region is familiar. This is the Northern Forest region as we think about it. 26 million acres, plus or minus, of forest stretching from Maine across New Hampshire, Vermont, and to the Tug Hill Plateau in New York. And this region has been a focus of regional work for now over 30 decades. And Charlie, among others I know on the call, were there at the start. The Center's programs focus in 3 areas: strengthening rural communities, growing forest-based business, and deepening forest stewardship. And today's presentation really fits into that bucket of strengthening forest-based businesses and deepening forest stewardship. We all know, I'm guessing, that markets for wood and wood products are volatile and constantly changing, particularly markets for low-grade material. And for, it seems like forever, state and industry stakeholders have been working across the northern forest to identify new and diversified markets for the full spectrum of products that come from the forest. After a raft of pulp and paper mill closures in Maine, in 2015 and 2016, these issues of markets for wood and wood products gained the attention again of our US congressional delegation. There was a federal agency response in 2016, which led to the creation of the Forest Opportunity Roadmap Initiative in Maine, which has invested substantially in analyzing Maine's competitive position in the global forest product sector and opportunities to bring new wood-using industries to the state. On about that same timeline, the Northeast State Foresters Association and others have been working to find resources to develop a similar information set for New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. And in 2019, the Northern Forest Center was able to provide funding for that work you're going to hear about today. And these resources came via the US Economic Development Administration and the US Endowment for Forestry and Communities. They are part of a larger Future Forest Economy initiative, which over 5 years is investing $3 million in projects that grow markets for wood and wood products from the northern forest. And these include so far wood-fired district heating for the University of Vermont campus in Burlington, marketing to grow use of modern wood heating, growing a market for structural round timber, which is a form of mass timber in northern Maine, master logger training, and a project with the State University of New York to encourage the US military to use domestic hardwoods instead of imported hardwoods for decking in military trailers. Today, we're really pleased to have Charlie with us to present the results of a lot of work over the last year in 4 components: timber projections and supply chain, regional attributes, weaknesses and opportunities for forest products, markets, maintenance and growth, identification and also benchmarking against other parts of the country for promising new product opportunities in the wood product sphere. And then finally, a discussion about forest products redevelopment sites across the 3 states that have been his focus. Our format today will be Charlie will present on each section, and then we'll pause for about 5 minutes for questions and answers on that bit of content. You can use the Q&A function, which should be a button at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions, and I will relay those to Charlie. And then we should have ample opportunity at the end of the meeting as well for open Q&A. So with that, Charlie, I will hand the microphone to you and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Trying to get the full screen up there. We just did it before, now it doesn't seem to want to do that. What are you seeing?
We've got it, it's in presentation mode, but I can see or it's not in presentation mode, but I can see your screen.
I'm not sure what's going on. Let me stop sharing and bring it back once more. And then if can't get it to be looking like we want, we'll run it that way. Here we go. Is that better?
Yeah, great.
Okay, super. Well, thanks, Joe, for the intro. Again, Charlie Levesque. I'm wearing my Northeast State Foresters Association hat for this presentation. I've been acting as their contract executive director since the late 1990s. Our firm is Innovative Natural Resource Solutions, as many of you know, and we work all over the country. We have offices in Maine and New Hampshire. The Northeast State Foresters Association has been around since the 1980s, and formally it's the state foresters from Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York, and sometimes informally also Southern New England, that come together to work on projects. And this is one of those projects. And I will say that, you know, we're very thankful for the funding that the Center, EDA, and the U.S. Endowment has provided for this project. It is intended to be really a basis for continued work on this. And we've just not yet found the funding to kind of take this information to the next level to really go out and recruit new forest products markets and expand existing markets. But that's the intent. So I'm going to go through the project reports. As Joe said, we've got 4 separate reports. I think these have all been available to you already, and if not, we will make them available to you, as we will this presentation. And so we're going to launch into these 4 separate sections, which Joe outlined, and I'll start with the first one relative to the forests and the timber inventories in the region. So for this, we relied on something I suspect many of you are familiar with, the USDA Forest Service's Forest Inventory Analysis, or commonly called FIA, as the data set from which we drew. And in our project, we actually broke down the 3-state region into 8 regions. You'll see 9 regions showing here. We did not include an analysis on the New York City, Long Island area for probably obvious reasons, simply because we're not likely to encourage or see expanded forest products markets in that part of the geography, but we did it in deep dive in the other 8 areas. I'm not going to show you the deep dive stuff, because I will say right up front once here, for all of these sections, we've got a short PowerPoint here, and we're covering about 500 pages of reports. So I encourage you to dig down deep, because there's a lot more detail than we're going to be able to provide you on this, including the detailed section by section here on the FIA timber information. So high level stuff, again, across the region, that for the 3 states, there's almost 24 million acres of timberland in this, and as you can expect, New York's a much bigger state than New Hampshire and Vermont. So most of the timberland, over 16 million acres, is in New York, and close to 4 million acres in Vermont and New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the most forested by land area, but New York and Vermont are also significantly forested, as is really the Northeast region as a whole compared to the country. This number may not mean a whole lot, just throwing it out there, but the standing inventory of timber in these 3 states is over 612 million cords. We can only say that's a lot of timber, and some of the details that we'll bring up after will kind of show that. But as with the acreage, most of this is in the state of New York. But the stocking in all these states is pretty substantial for the timber resource. And we'll get into some of the details here. A really important metric that we often use to talk about timber and stocking, in other words, the density of the timber across the landscape, is how much exists per acre. And simply put here, it's over 25 cords per acre on average. Remember, this is all timberland in these states. And that is substantial stocking. And in fact, some cases it's land that's overstocked, which means that the land is not growing as much timber as it could. Or if you're thinking about climate change, it's not sequestering as much carbon as it could, simply because there are too many trees taking up limited space. That's a good thing. The long and short is there's a lot of timber that's standing in these three states. And just a quick comparison, because we're doing a little bit of a comparison with Maine, which is far ahead in this work. Maine's forests on average are stocked with around 17 cords per acre. So you can see these three states have substantially more timber stocking than Maine has. Another key metric, which really is looking more towards what is going to happen, is what is happening now and in the future, is really this annual net growth to removals ratio. So it goes something like this. Gross growth is all growth that goes on annually in the forest. And if you take away the natural mortality, you have something called annual net growth. And then if you take away from that the annual removals, then you have a metric where one is break even. In other words, the inventory of timber does not increase year to year. Anything over one, you've got increasing inventory. So even in Maine, which is a lot less in the way of a ratio, is over the one mark. So they're increasing their timber and carbon in the forest every year. You can see in Vermont, New Hampshire, and New York, substantial increases, well over 150, and in Vermont and New York, over 2. So, for every one unit of timber that's harvested, there's 2 growing. So, the inventory is simply going up and up year after year. And I will say that for these 3 states, this has been happening really since the 1950s, when this kind of data started to be collected. And so this is for timber and carbon. Remember, roughly half the timber volumes is in carbon. And so the same thing, the same metrics, the same projections really apply to the carbon as well in these forests, if you're thinking carbon. So to look very quickly at what the stocking of timber is by species in these states, this is the New Hampshire graph that shows white pine, red maple, red oak, eastern hemlock are the top species. Well over half of are in those categories. And then New York, quite different: red maple, sugar maple, white pine, ash, and then hemlock. So a very different mix. So, much more to hardwood stocking than New Hampshire is. And in Vermont, as you might expect, sugar maple is number 1, and red maple comes next, followed by eastern hemlock and eastern white pine, and then spruce and balsam fir. So it gives you a good sense of where most of the stocking is. Many other species, and you got a selection on these graphs, but long and short is we've got a lot of very valuable timber species that are growing in these 3 states. So that, most of what I just showed you is kind of historical information that's looking at the past or the present. And we wanted to really take a look at what is likely to happen in the future relative to the timber in these states based on a number of assumptions. And we used a computer model that was developed about 10 years ago called the Northern Forest Biomass Project Evaluator. And it's more than evaluating biomass. It evaluates all timber, but it really is a model to look at what could happen in the future. And so just remember with this is projection. It's not a prediction. It uses a bunch of assumptions. And I will say that this is the New Hampshire single run that's called the constant run, but we did multiple runs for each state, and all that's in the reports. But what this is showing is basically at current growth rates and with current harvesting that's going on, what's likely to happen in the next 20 years with the timber in the region. In New Hampshire, you can see it's not going to double, but it's going to increase substantially, close to double in that time period if nothing else changes today. Again, another indicator that points to there being plenty of timber to expand markets in the region. And that's really what we're looking to determine. So that was New Hampshire. This is New York. New York, a similar increase, not quite as much as what we're showing in New Hampshire, but still a substantial increase projection for the next 20 years. And then Vermont, more similar in terms of magnitude to what we showed you for New Hampshire. So again, this is simply the constant run model where we're saying if things all stay the same, business as usual, what might it look like in the future? We've got other runs in there that increase growth rates, that increase harvest levels. And I can only say that if I put all of those up, and we don't have time to do that, the graphs wouldn't look tremendously different from what you see here, simply because there's so much timber stocking out there that even making adjustments to growth and harvest and all kinds of things like that, you just don't change the projection because of the magnitude of the timber volumes that are out there. So as part of this first report, we also looked at the supply chain and to emphasize the primary supply chain businesses that are in the three-state region in the forest products industry, right? And so in that primary sector, we're not looking at secondary manufacturing such as furniture manufacturing or other uses at that level. We're looking at the primary level, right? Forest to market is really what we're looking. So that includes foresters, loggers and truckers, sawmills, pulp and paper mills, biomass power plants, wood pellet mills, and also concentration yards, which in and of themselves are not markets, but they are a place where timber goes to go to these other markets. And you can see the numbers in the chart here. I'm not going to read them, are substantial. It really points to the fact that the supply chain infrastructure is substantial and it is robust. I will make a caveat about the number of foresters in New York. You see, if you're actually looking at this and you question, New York's a much bigger state, how come there are so few foresters there? It's not an accurate number. In New Hampshire and Vermont, there is forester licensing. So we have an accurate number of the number of licensed foresters in those states, and that's what's represented in those numbers. But in New York, there is not licensing. And so we don't have an accurate number. We have lists that are maintained by the state of New York, but there are more private foresters and public foresters out there than that number represents. So just to make clear why that number looks a little off, but shows a robust supply chain. And the value of the timber industry in this region is substantial. You can see jobs, direct payroll value, and direct economic output, which is over $16 billion a year across the three-state region. You'll notice how many employees are shown on the direct jobs for New York. Again, New York's much bigger, but New York also has a substantial secondary forest products economy, which we're not really talking about today, but a lot of the employees that you see in that large number are in that secondary economy as opposed to the primary. We're not able to break it out quite that way. Long and short, pretty substantial forest products economy that exists today, even though a lot of changes have gone on, as Joe mentioned in the introduction. And here's a little graphic that simply shows this supply chain. It's really helpful to understand what it looks like. And what you're seeing, just generally is it's all over the geography of these three states. And the categories are on that left legend that we just went through in terms of numbers. So it's helpful to see that stuff is spread around. And if you studied this, you'd get a better sense that it is really spread around substantially in the three-state region. And that's helpful to know if you're trying to expand industry and also if you're trying to expand production at existing facilities. So here are the conclusions, and then we're going to take some questions. The conclusion in this first section of the report is that the three-state region has substantial timber volumes and species available to expand forest products manufacturing, both at existing manufacturing facilities, expanding production, and new manufacturing. And then, essential to that happening is a supply chain that can get the timber from the forest to the mills. And that supply chain infrastructure is robust, although it's been stressed in recent years due to the reduction in low-grade markets, as many of you know. And We know for a fact that some logging operations are a lot smaller than they were 3 or 4 years ago, and a few have gone out of business. Not a substantial number, but that has been affected. But the overall supply chain is substantial, and that is the key take home from this. And from there, Joe, I'm going to turn it back to you, and you're going to go through what we've got for questions. Looks like we have a few.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Charlie. And obviously the first part of attracting new markets and potential new business is to paint the picture of the opportunity, which this clearly does. So yeah, we've got a couple of questions. First from Charlie Hancock asking, does the net positive ratio take into account rates of forest loss and conversion to get to that kind of true net sense of additionality and loss?
Yeah, excellent question. Just because we don't have that much time, you'll notice if you go back to this PowerPoint, the slide that I used the word removals, not harvest. So that actually includes two things. It includes timber harvest and also removal of timberland from that land classification. In other words, land that has gone from timber or forest land to non-forest. So it does take that into account. Good question.
Great. And then Dave Harvey asks, were chip plants included in the primary user list?
Chip plants are actually in that concentration yard list. So the answer is yes.
Great. And then a couple about sort of the forest itself. Peter Corey is wondering about, to the extent you can, talk about the potential economic impact of emerald ash borer in the sector, in 5 or 10 years, and maybe also, there are other invasives, Charlie, I know that folks are worried about, like
Sure.
hemlock woolly adelgid, realizing it's projection, but what would you say about the potential impact?
Good question. We know that, of the big insects we're worried about, emerald ash borer is probably the one that's going to completely decimate that species in its range. Not that we'll lose it forever or completely, but everything points to the fact that at some point in time, maybe, and even in my lifetime, we're going to have a lot less white ash and black ash and green ash than we have today. Now, the important thing, if you go back, and I'm not going to go back to show you those pie charts, but remember the species distribution in all the states. Ash makes up a fairly small part of the standing timber volume in the states. And so while we value ash, and it's a very much valued hardwood species for manufacturing, it's a small part of the supply chain and manufacturing base. And so is it going to affect things? Certainly, because there are many mills that are in the hardwood sector that use ash without question, and they're going to lose that species. And so it will affect things, but it won't be a major hit to the industry because there are many other hardwood species that are used and frankly higher prized than white ash. So, for the other invasives, Asian longhorn beetle, it's yet to be seen whether or not that will do serious damage, because the MO to date has been to eradicate it, not to try to constrain it, but to eradicate it. And, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in the region have been spent to make sure that the Asian longhorn beetle, which, basically can feed on practically any tree species, does not take hold in the region. So that leaves the hemlock woolly adelgid as one of the big three. And, the experts in this have told me that while hemlock woolly adelgid is spreading throughout this region, we are blessed in that we still have enough cold in winters in most of the 3-state region to keep the populations from decimating that species. If any of you have been to the Appalachian region where hemlock stands exist in nearly pure form like we can find in these 3 states, I've been and seen completely dead hemlock stands in the Appalachians, and I've yet to see that in this 3-state region. And the entomologists are really saying it could happen, but it's not likely in at least the short term, simply because we have enough cold to kill back the hemlock woolly adelgid, so it's not killing whole stands of trees. Is it killing individual trees? Yes, it is. Killing parts of trees? Yes, it is, but maybe not as devastating as it is in the Appalachians, and we can only hope that that's true.
Thanks, Charlie. We've got more questions, but I think in the interest of making sure we get through all of your content, let's keep going. But for those who have asked questions that we haven't gotten to right now, we are going to have, again, time at the end to come back to some of those. So Charlie, why don't you take us away into part 2?
Will do. Thanks for those great questions. It really adds to the presentation. Okay. Programs, there we go. So the second report is really looking at the uniqueness of these 3 states, and more particularly the weaknesses and opportunities that might affect wood market retention and growth in new industries. And so really important information to understand where we might go. So this is a repeat of what you just heard from the first report, which is on the timber side, we have substantial high and low value timber of all species, notwithstanding ash, which we just discussed, which probably is not going to be here for that much longer. But timber overall is a significant strength in the region if we're looking to expand markets and grow new markets. The supply chain infrastructure, which we also just talked about, is robust. I mentioned that, the low grade market turndown in recent years has certainly hurt the supply chain, starting in the woods to getting it to mill, but it hasn't done so to the point where we're seeing any substantial log shortages or other supply shortages at mills. The supply chain from the forest to the mills is incredibly resilient in that I know personally a number of logging operations that used to have 3 or 4 crews, and they're down to a single crew now because of the loss of low grade markets, because that was a substantial part of their business. A lot of that extra equipment is just parked. Some of it's been sold, but if the markets exist, the infrastructure from foresters to loggers to truckers will grow to get wood to market. That's a clear, that's clear because it's happened many times in the past. So while it's reduced some, we're not worried about that part of the infrastructure as we move forward. The solid wood subsector, the sawmills in the region have had some of their best years in the last couple of years, and they're booming now, both softwood and hardwood. So we see that continuing. Most of you know that the pulp and paper sector in this 3-state region looks a lot different than it used to. Really the loss in our recent times since 1999 were the 2 pulp mills in northern New Hampshire, but we still have 2 in the state of New York. Maine still has a substantial crop of 6 pulp mills, and those 2 in New York and the 6 in Maine, which draw timber from New Hampshire and Vermont, maybe even a little from New York east, that sector is fairly stable now. We've had tremendous losses, but the mills that exist are pretty stable. Had a substantial loss with the explosion at the J pulp mill last April, but still the remaining mills are likely going to be there for a while. Biomass electricity generation is still in existence in the region. It's much smaller than it was even 2 or 3 years ago, and it's not going to grow unless somehow through federal or state policy, that form of generating electricity is seen as climate friendly. It's not going to grow. We're going to see a lot of that go out, even though, it's barely holding on as we speak. So that looks a lot different, and it's not likely to grow. Anything can happen. Things can change. But one little bright spot is that the biomass thermal side of things, right? We're heating commercial buildings and obviously homes as well with pellets and with wood chips. That is growing. It's small relative to biomass electricity. It's really tiny, but it's growing and continues to grow. And if, as the fossil fuel prices increase, particularly heating oil, it's a direct correlation to increased use of pellets and chips to heat buildings. And we'll see more of that. And even with the low fossil fuel prices we've had in the last few years, that industry has grown, not substantially, but it is a bright opportunity, simply at a different scale and much smaller than biomass electricity. So transportation is a key component of the supply infrastructure to grow an industry, and roads are the way we move timber and final product. And so this is a map simply showing the interstate highway system in the region. Any of you who work in the region know that we're pretty good north-south. We're a little less so east-west, but it still covers the region. But more importantly, for a lot of the stuff that happens early in the infrastructure, getting wood from the forest to market, we're relying on more local public roads. And these maps actually have plotted all the public roads in the three-state region. So you can see that, the region is covered. Having said that, there are a few areas that are lacking, and you can see them. Those of you who are from the Adirondacks, you know that the road system there is much more limited than other parts of New York, and the same occurs in some of the areas around the Green Mountains in Vermont and also northern New Hampshire. So, there are some spots that could be improved, and something I didn't talk about here that we certainly talk about in the reports is, bridges are often a constraint, and we do have, bridge problems, weight restrictions in a lot of the rural areas to get wood around, but there are no places where you really can't get the wood out because of lack of roads. What is a little bit disheartening is that we still don't have consistent truck weight regulations in the three-state area, and same thing if we combine Maine with these three states. They're slightly different. That can be a problem. Obviously, the infrastructure, the folks who do the trucking have figured a way around it, but it would be much better for the region if we could have consistent truck weights. So for rail, a very different situation. So rail does not play a substantial role in the forest products industry in the region. I'm not saying it doesn't play any role for final product, but it's just not very substantial. And here's why. There are classes of railroads in the country, and you'll notice that this class 1, which really represents the high volume rail that makes a lot of money for the rail companies, you can see it's not in this region. And that's simply because the larger users of rail, such as coal, which obviously is reducing, oil, corn, ethanol, and other products like that, just doesn't happen in this region. And in the other parts of the country where those are very strong, the forest products industry can piggyback on those industries to get rail time, to buy rail cars, and it works. But here we don't have that. And the class 2, 3, and 4 rail that we have, because yes, we have rail, we have tracks, just do not have enough business to make it economical for the forest products industry to use it substantially. So it's fairly minor now. But things move with the road system. And so while it's minor, it's not a limitation necessarily. Although if things looked like they looked elsewhere in the country, it might provide another avenue and maybe reduce transportation costs. But that isn't going to happen in this region. So, for finished product for shipping, we certainly have a robust set of ports in the Northeast corridor, as many of you know. The ports really are substantial, and we really have access to them from all parts of the three-state region, and they do get used. Some areas have better access than others. The far northern reaches, although some of those ports in Canada on the Great Lakes are used by some of those areas, are valuable, but that's not a limitation in terms of growing the industry in the region. So, internet, mobile coverage, and electricity, utilities, very important for any manufacturing. So starting with internet, we know that internet connections are strong when you get to the urban areas or near the urban areas. In the rural areas where most of the industry is located, less so. Not to say that it's not in many of these places, and that people in the industry are not finding a ways to make sure they've got good internet speed at the mills, because there's a lot of technology that's using it these days at the mills. But the fact is that currently there's some areas that it really could use improvement. So this can be somewhat of a limitation for expansion, but it's spotty in terms of where that issue is. But anybody looking to site a new facility certainly is going to look at this as one of the issues they will look at in terms of siting something. And there are some areas that need improvement. Mobile coverage is very similar to internet. Strong in the urban areas and a little less so, but growing in the areas of the three-state region that are rural, where this industry is substantial and where it's likely to grow. Probably not telling you anything you don't know in that. Electricity is probably the most important of the three utilities we're talking about. Here's some graphs that are showing comparisons, including Maine, of electricity prices for industrial, residential, and for combined. Long and short is electricity costs for the industrial sector, particularly in Vermont and New Hampshire, are among the highest in the nation. New York's got some alternatives that allow for better industrial prices, at least in most of the state. So there's a bit of an advantage there. But electricity prices are very high in the Northeast, and that can be a limitation. But having said that, there are exceptions. There's self-generation that's going on, and that's growing. And there's also utility contracts that can work for particular or individual manufacturing facilities that can get around this. But clearly, the electricity side of things is not a bright spot for growth in the industry. What about labor? So hard to dig down substantially with the metrics here. We just did do a little overview, but one thing to look at is the education level of the workforce in the region. And, we don't have the rest of the country, but we can say that overall, this region has a better or a higher educated workforce or potential workforce than other parts of the country. So that's a good sign, certainly. But having said that, here's some conclusions around workforce issues for the forest products industry in the three-state region. We have a very much an aging workforce, both from the supply side, supply chain side, from the forest to the mill and in the mills as well. And that's a problem. But really, that's no different than any other manufacturing sector or subsector in the United States, and for that matter, in North America, right? So we've got an aging workforce for the people we need to be filling the jobs that are necessary in manufacturing. And so while this industry is having problems, finding workers to fill, especially entry-level jobs, the pandemic didn't help at all because what happened with unemployment benefits only prolonged a problem or exacerbated a problem by providing extra funds during a pandemic when most of the forest products industry remained open. And so we're coming out of that now. But the industry as a whole, there's probably not a mill that you talk to who wouldn't tell you, could we use more labor? Yes. And so labor is a significant constraint in the region, but it is no different than any other manufacturing that's going on. Clearly the part of what has happened, and it will continue to happen, is that industries will pay more for labor because they need it that much, because there are many individual mills that are looking to expand, whether it's a second shift or just to get enough on a shift, and they're already doing that. And so wages are certainly increasing. We'll have to in order to get the enough of a workforce, but it's a constraint without question. So the other thing, big thing that we certainly need to think about in expanding industry, both at existing facilities and in new greenfield or brownfield site redevelopment, is there capital there for somebody, for a business or for an entrepreneur, if they want to site a new facility or expand existing industry in the forest products industry. The graph at the left is showing all of the capital investment in the U.S. Over a period of time from 2012 to very recently, and it's showing an upward trend. And we don't have the data for 2020, and it continued into 2020. We'll have the data shortly for that. So that's a good sign. That means more and more capital is going into this industry to expand. But anecdotally is an easier way probably to look at what's happening in this region, because in that same period, if you look at the bulleted list on the right, and I don't want to read it, but you'll see that we've got new pellet mills, new sawmills, we've got substantial expansion in sawmills, also in the pulp and paper mills that exist. A lot of investment has gone in there. Together, among all of these things in that period, well over $1 billion worth of private capital has gone in to expand. That's a good sign. If there's no capital expenditure going on in the existing industry, that tells you that those who have the capital to invest are not interested and don't see opportunity here. But that has happened, and that's a really good sign for the future as well. So we believe that capital, while not necessarily in every situation is available at levels that folks want and need, it's out there and it's being used as we speak, and that's a good sign. So the other part of this equation for business is the climate. And I'm certainly not going to read all the words on the screen here, but I needed to encapsulate what's in the report and into these categories. So for income taxes, those of you who live in the region, you know that the states are different. New York and Vermont have personal and business income taxes. New Hampshire has a business income tax. So income taxes are fairly high in the region. New Hampshire overall has the lowest tax burden among the states, but that's not to say that taxes aren't high. Property taxes are certainly high. Sale taxes exist in New York and Vermont. They do not exist in New Hampshire, and that's a bit of an advantage there. Regulatory climate, that's not an easy thing to come to a conclusion on. We gathered all kinds of data around this, and it's not a single issue or policy, right? It's a bunch of different things, from permitting to whether or not the state government's willing to work with developers to streamline development processes. It's a lot of different things. We can say sort of general conclusions are certainly New York, has the most regulation relative to business. It's a big state. It has a huge economy. And Vermont has what would be considered a more regulatory climate than New Hampshire has. And Vermont, of course, has Act 250, which is a big deal for the forest products industry and potential expansion. But New York certainly wins or loses the prize, I guess, for the regulatory climate. But there's a flip side to that, and that is that item number 4. Even if there's a lot of regulatory issues and permitting required, another important thing to draw industry and draw expansion is the business assistance that is available. New York State has a substantial and really a massive state budget. And within that is really substantial resources to entice business. And so while it may be highly regulated, there's a lot of assistance, there's a lot of tax breaks available for businesses to expand and to grow in New York. And that's an advantage over the smaller states of Vermont and New Hampshire. Well, there may be less regulation in these other states. They certainly have economic development folks to work with industries, but Vermont and New Hampshire has, less in the way of actual cash or tax breaks or whatever. And Vermont has a better situation than New Hampshire. So it kind of goes on a flip side from the regulatory climate. So you need to think about all these things together in trying to describe business climate. So this second report has a lot in it, and here are the major conclusions, which we just ran through, right? The timber supply and the supply chain is a strength for the region. The transportation infrastructure in the region, which is heavily based on the road network, is adequate, certainly. Rail is not a strength. The port system is certainly adequate for the region. There is room for improvement in the road system and the bridge situation, the weight limitation in bridges. And we got this inconsistent truck weights issue across the states, but it's not a severe limitation for growth in the industry. In the issue of utilities, of the three, electricity is the biggest deal because internet and mobile situations are improving all the time as we speak, but electricity costs are high. New York has somewhat of an advantage for industrial rates, but it's a substantial issue across the region without question. Workforce, labor availability is poor, but again, it's the same with other manufacturing industries. It's not like this industry has it worse than other manufacturing. It's the same, and the issue comes down to entry level and what kind of wages are being offered to get people to be employed at those levels, which is severely needed, clearly, in this industry as with others. Capital availability appears to be adequate. Not that more opportunity with cheap capital wouldn't be a godsend, but there are many opportunities to seek capital for growth. And so we believe that can happen if somebody wants to do it. And then for business climate, different among the three states, but overall, the business climate issue should not be a complete constraint or even a substantial one in any of the three states. So again, rifle through a lot of information, and the reports have a lot more detail, and I'll turn it back to you, Joe, so we can try to answer a few questions.
Thanks, Charlie. We do have some, but just to give you a little break, I'll offer a few anecdotes, I think, of how we at the center see this playing out. One of our programs is convening the Northern Forest Board Forum, which is a CEO peer-to-peer roundtable of primarily secondary wood products manufacturers in Vermont and in Maine. And this drumbeat of workforce, workforce, workforce has been consistent, I think, for many months. And as you said, exacerbated by the pandemic. And at the same time, that's juxtaposed by just like fairly insane demand of late for so many products, whether it's going into home building, anything related to home construction, but also home furnishings, decorative items like wooden bowls. So we really kind of see that both the opportunity and the potential break on that in workforce. And also striking recently here, many more companies talking about robotics and automation, as a means to, not really seeing an end to the workforce challenge and thinking about other ways to address it. And then lastly, just a connection around broadband and cell coverage. I mean, we see that absolutely as a potential barrier for companies, but also for workforce. I mean, increasingly that's an amenity, not an amenity, a necessity that workers are looking for. So as we think about overall, how is the Northern Forest region attracting people to work in all types of businesses, there's a connection there.
I'm sure, Joe, you would agree on the internet mobile coverage issue. It is improving as we go along here. There's lots of efforts going on, and the centers involved and many others are. So it's not where it should be, but it is improving.
I totally agree. And I think that the pandemic, if one of the bright sides to it, if there are any, I think, is that it's absolutely raised awareness of broadband as a necessity, not a luxury. So Charlie, one question here from Peter Madden that kind of ties together part one and part two. He asked for a new mill to get capital financing and locate in the Northern Forest. Are there landowners who have the ability to enter into long-term fiber supply contracts? I don't know that that's something you specifically addressed in the reports, but have a hunch you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, we certainly do, because as a company, our consulting company works in that area all the time. And that question gets asked an awful lot. And, not that there aren't a few exceptions, but they're minor. The reality in this industry is that's not how it works. There are not, and we work with developers all the time coming in and they say, can we lock up our timber supply for the next 10 years? And the answer is really no, because that's not how the industry works. It's really on short-term agreements, and really kind of, in the marketplace is where timber gets bought, and people in the supply chain actually don't generally want to lock up with any particular market. And that goes from the landowner to the loggers, and the truckers usually want to be able to play the market field. And so the long-term agreements are not how business is done in this industry. And while there are few exceptions, there are not many. We don't see that changing in any great degree, but it's not a constraint. It really isn't, because that's how the industry has worked for the last couple hundred years, and works fine, because there are so many suppliers out there in the infrastructure. A mill doesn't have to rely on one or two suppliers, where if they lose them, their business goes down. It's not how that works. Mills often have dozens, if not 100 suppliers of timber, and that's how they hedge against that issue over time. Good question.
Thanks, Charlie. There is another question about are there any bright spots in the low grade markets? But I think you're gonna speak to that in this next section. So why don't we keep going into part three?
Okay, let's do that. So this reports 3 and 4 only because we had kind of two components and we combined them here, which is really the product selection and then the benchmarking. This is a key part of the whole effort to really say, okay, now we know where the weaknesses and strengths are in the region. What should we go after? If we're in an economic development mode and we actually want to actively pursue expansion with existing industries and new manufacturing, what should we go after? So the tenets of all this really come down to this. We wanted to review all possible primary forest products that could be developed in the region, right, as a starting point, and then go from there to narrow it down. So from there, we determined the best suite of potential forest products to pursue based on a bunch of criteria, some of the stuff we just talked about in the strengths and weaknesses. And then once we had a short list, and I'm going to show you that short list in a minute, we then wanted to say, okay, if that's where we think the strength is for these states, who will be the likely competitors, and how can we compete against those other places, those other geographies? So that's really key. And I will say up front that what this effort for the three states has decided is that the market, the best market for finished products coming out of these industries is right on our doorstep. This megalopolis, you could start from Portland, Maine and go down to Newark or even Washington, D.C. We have the highest concentration of urban America here, and there are millions and millions of people and consumers. So really, we're saying overall, that's our best market, not our only market, not that you don't use export markets, but we're not concentrating on export markets as part of this whole effort. So we're going to jump back for Maine, simply because, as Joe said up front, we were trying to do some similar work that it's been done in Maine, and Maine is ahead of these three states in this, but this is the product grand list that Maine started with, and I'm not going to go through this. It's in the reports, and you'll get to see this PowerPoint if you want to look at this list more closely. So this is the kind of list that we started with. We actually added a few from it, and in Maine, they use these criteria to take that list and to break it down and to come up with something that is much more reasonable and where to focus: market, competition, barriers to entry, et cetera, because you really need to look at these very carefully with the data to understand where you might have strengths in a region. In the end, the For Maine effort has decided on these 6 products: nanocellulose, pyrolysis oil, dissolving pulp, and the MDF, which is medium density fiberboard, and then LVL, which is laminated veneer lumber, and then cellulosic sugar. So you'll notice that 1, 2, 3, and 6 are really based on kind of what I call the cooking part of this, breaking down fibers of timber to their basic elements to make other products. And, Maine still has a substantial pulp and industry, paper industry on which that can be built. Not all of these are really part of the pulp and paper industry, but there's a lot that can be done at the existing mills in that way. And so that's partly why they came out as they did. And then they took those and they benchmarked them against the countries on the left: Finland, Germany, Russia, China, and Canada, but particularly Ontario and Canada, not Quebec, because Maine really considers Quebec part of the same forest products economy, and then other states of Georgia, Minnesota, and Oregon. So that's what they did. Well, we did a bit different for these other states because these states are very different. And so we also took a look at what are the major differences, and I've talked a little bit about these, comparing Maine to the 3-state region. One of the big ones is simply the amount of timber in the various species is much more substantial, and a huge advantage for New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont. We went over that before. But breaking down these other categories, on the supply chain infrastructure, believe it or not, there are more sawmills per area in each of New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont than in Maine. However, average mill size in Maine is bigger. So so the output overall is not necessarily greater in these other states on a per area basis. But obviously, Maine has a much more substantial pulp and paper sector, as we've discussed. But the logger and trucker density and forester density, that's all fairly similar across the 4-state region. Transportation infrastructure, not a whole lot different. Obviously, Maine's got substantial deep water ports in the state, and that's a bit of an advantage if you're looking at export markets, but we're not. So that may not be an issue for these states. And for internet, mobile coverage, and electricity costs, not a whole lot different in Maine compared to these other states. It's a similar region in that way. Electricity costs are high across the region, and certainly no different in the workforce end of things. Everybody is looking for workers, and as Joe said, that's an area that work is going on, but it's a real sore spot and a limitation for industry growth in the sector. In the business climate sector, Maine, not a substantial, improvement over these other states. New Hampshire, again, if we have to combine everything, New Hampshire may be best, but there are different disadvantages for New Hampshire and maybe Maine next, followed by New York and Vermont. So that gives you sort of a bit of a comparison. So now let's shift to the 3-state region that we really focused on here in New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont. And out of a very long list, which I'm not showing here, the initial ranking got us down to 10, really 14, because when we ranked them 10 to 14, we're all ranked the same. And I'm not going to spend any time talking about the big list, but I will in the short list that's coming up here. But you can see the kinds of things kind of range from low-grade stuff to a few things that are not quite so low-grade, but a lot of them really are in the low-grade category that we think have grand opportunity in the region. And then we rank those using these criteria to get a sense for which ones would be the likeliest. Now, that's not to say that anything that didn't make this list doesn't, have potential. It might, if some entrepreneur wanted to drill down. But based on everything that we've learned in this, we've come down with the following 6 as our target for the 3-state region. Pyrolysis oil, I'm going to talk about each of these in a second. Cellulose insulation, green diesel, sawn timber, which is really not necessarily a primary product, right? This is mass timber, which is cross-laminated timber, laminated timbers. It is in that sector, which, is getting a lot of airplay these days, but there's a great opportunity here. So we've put it in anyways. And then also biochar and bioplastic composites. We took those and then we benchmarked them against states that we felt were most competitive with the New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont states. And they're not the same ones that Maine did. Things are very different. So we looked very carefully. And if you get to read the report, you'll see lots of information about Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and West Virginia that allowed us to benchmark against those states to say, where does the 3-state region kind of shake out with these? And the long and short is that we believe the 3-state regions shake out very well against those competitor states. And so we believe that we can compete in these 6 products. So let's drill down just for a bit to talk about the 6 products. The first one is pyrolysis oil or bio oil. And some of you may know what this is. This is made in an environment without oxygen. And ultimately, the product you see on the right is a substitute for heating oil, but not really diesel. It can be refined further, and we talk about green diesel in a minute, but there's a tremendous opportunity here because buildings in the region are heated with fuel oil, number 2, number 6 heating oil. And this pyrolysis oil made right from wood chips is a direct substitute. Now, there's some things about it that require a little bit of hardware changes in the boilers and furnaces that would use it, but it's very, very possible to use it. In fact, a Canadian manufacturer called Ensign has been selling this bio oil that they produce in Ontario and Quebec, and it's been used in some commercial establishments, about a half dozen in New England, for over a half dozen years. So this is camera ready, sort of ready to go. We just got to find a way to do it. And there are reasons why it hasn't happened why we don't have a pyrolysis oil manufacturing facility in the region yet. And we're learning about why that is. Second one, cellulose insulation. Many of you know about the GoLab construction of a facility to make this very product, which is underway as we speak. And they expect to be producing at least some of these products by early next year, 2022. But there's opportunity for more than one manufacturing facility using, again, wood chips as raw material. So again, another low-grade market to make insulation that is solid board insulation you see on the left, batten insulation, or blown in loose fill. We can get cellulose insulation today. It comes from Europe. None of this is made in the United States, or very little bit is made in Canada. So this is a tremendous opportunity in a low-grade market, as is pyrolysis oil. And so is green diesel, or more commonly called renewable diesel, also made from low-grade wood. Here's the thing with green diesel. It's really a further refinement from that pyrolysis oil, but they might get there a different way. But here's the big important thing with this compared to the pyrolysis oil. This is 100% substitute for fossil fuel diesel. So that means it can be used in transportation fuels, which, as we know, this industry runs on fossil fuel diesel. So it can be completely substituted. And remember, diesel is also jet fuel. And so it can be used for that. And there's been some tests already using it for jet fuel. So this is could be a major thing. And, some issues like major federal public policy can turn this thing on tomorrow. But the long and short is we know how to make this, or I should say the scientists on the tech end know how to make this. And there's some demonstration plants that have made it, and we can do it. And so now it needs to be expanded to sort of commercial level plants. The sawn on the mass timber side, many of you probably hearing a lot about this. Laminated timbers and cross-laminated timber, which is that panel that's coming down for a flooring panel. tremendous opportunity. We have a number of mass timber buildings in the Northeast region. The Pacific Northwest beats us in kind of getting a jump start on this industry, but there are over 10 buildings that are either planned or under construction in the Northeast region as we speak. And so there's a tremendous opportunity. But this is not a low-grade product, because the input material for a cross-laminated timber plant, for instance, is actually boards. It's going to be spruce fir or hemlock boards that are 2x material that are then laminated or glued together into panels, 3-ply, 5-ply, 7-ply, 9-ply. And so it's a high-value product, but there's tremendous opportunity for expansion. So biochar. When we put this in there, Joe Short, asked us, some probing questions and good questions around this, because it's been largely a boutique industry. And frankly, it is a boutique industry today. It's very small production facilities across the country. But this is material that, again, where you're cooking wood at very low oxygen levels, and the primary products have been for filtration of water and other liquids, and also as a soil amendment for agriculture. But really, the biggest market and what could jumpstart this into a tremendous opportunity is not those products, although they will continue to use this material and the opportunity will expand for those. It's really in what part of what part of the climate change public policy we have that includes biochar as part of the solution. Because once you take wood and turn it into biochar, the carbon that's in there cannot be released into the atmosphere, right? So it can be used for other things. And just like if you're taking solid wood and putting it into cross-laminated timber, that's long-lived. Well, this is even longer-lived. And so as part of the climate solution, it might have potential. But, the issues around climate change, public policy are being developed, at least for the Biden administration, as we speak. So something big could happen here. And that's why it's on the list. It's already happened in Europe. And a company in California has just qualified to sell carbon credits around biochar production, and there are those in the region right now who are looking to do the same. And lastly, anything that you can make out of fossil fuel based plastic, you can make out of bio-based plastic. So, just a few pictures of stuff that normally would be made out of fossil fuel plastic. You can make it out of 100% wood-based plastic or bioplastic. And so, how much of these things we use in society, packaging, all kinds of stuff. There's an opportunity there, and this is just starting to happen. And this is a low-grade input kind of industry as well. So tremendous opportunity. And as you can see, of 1 through 6, we've concentrated on those that are very heavy to low-grade markets, and that's really what the industry needs. So again, a quick conclusion: the 6 products we just went over, we've concluded are the best to pursue. Not that those other products on the short list that I showed you couldn't be pursued also, but we believe these have the best opportunity, and a lot of effort ought to go into those. And with that, Joe, I'm going to stop and we'll take some questions about this part of the report.
Thanks, Charlie. And I think the report also notes that there's some existing products, other products in the sawn category, things like wood pellets that you all acknowledge are very much here, and there are opportunities in those as well. But what you did here through your ranking was really identify some of those newer opportunities. But as you said, those are not missing. There's a question about the carbon calculations of substituting pyrolysis oil for fuel oil. I imagine we could ask the same question about biodiesel. And I know the report speaks a bit to that, but can you say any more about what's known or not known about carbon emission benefits subbing in pyrolysis oil or biodiesel for their fossil counterparts?
So there have been some what I'd call proprietary analysis that have been done on that front, full carbon life cycle analysis that were funded through individual companies. And frankly, for instance, the biochar that I mentioned in the European market for carbon credits around biochar, in order to access that market, you have to have a life cycle analysis done for carbon for that. So a bunch has been done. But, unlike, we've got good analysis done for now chips and pellets, we don't have any substantial public analysis that have been done for pyrolysis oil or green diesel or renewable diesel, but those are coming. I know of several that are underway, and so we're going to know that pretty soon. If I had to guess, because we know when you take into account, cradle to grave on pellets and chips, even though people have argued otherwise, they look very favorable compared to fossil fuels. In fact, they're advantageous over fossil fuels when you really take into account everything in terms of a carbon life cycle analysis. I'd be very surprised if we didn't see that for pyrolysis oil as well as renewable diesel.
Thanks. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned we've done some work at the center to look at that carbon equation for wood pellets, and it's clearly carbon better. I would say it's probably, given the substitution benefits, fair to assume that that's there. But as you say, it's really important to have those analyses, because particularly as climate policy picks up and things like biofuel standards are being developed, those of us, I think, interested in the forest product sector have an interest in making sure that these types of products are, their environmental benefits and climate benefits are recognized. Charlie, I'm not seeing any. I know there's other questions out there on this section. They haven't popped up yet, so I would invite folks to keep lobbing them in, or also if you have comments as well. I think this piece of these potential new products is, well, in my opinion, some of the most interesting stuff in the work that Charlie has done. So if you've got comments or other things you'd like to add to the discussion, please drop them in the Q&A. But Charlie, why don't we finish out, and then we do have some questions from earlier that we haven't gotten to yet that we'll come back to after your last section.
You bet. And I do want to give credit to my company partners, Eric Kingsley and Charlie Niebling, because they also did some work on this project as well. I was a lead researcher and writer, but they helped out a tremendous amount in the project. So I want to thank them. Okay, I'm going to try to advance here. It seems to be stuck again. There we go. Okay, so the last report is on the development and redevelopment sites. So this is going to be a fairly quick report. And that is to say, okay, if somebody is wanting to invest to either expand existing industries or to build new manufacturing facilities, are there industrial sites in the region where they could do this? I mean, we might assume that there are, but we did a deep dive to really confirm that there are, and we'll come to a conclusion on that. But we actually started with comparing the primary forest product sites. Most of these were sawmills, but not only sawmills, in the three-state region that were in existence in the mid-1990s, but not today. And that's the map that you see. I mean, it shows you that, and I have to say that, a lot of these sites are very small manufacturing sites, small sawmills, because in the sawmill sector, we're producing probably similar volumes in output product that we were in the 1990s from that sector, but it's just that it's being produced by a lot fewer very, very large mills that are expanding every time you turn around. So while these sites went out as forest products manufacturing, it doesn't mean that we've lost that much of the industry over time, but it points to the fact that there are a lot of potential sites that could be redeveloped. So that was one kind of data set that we mined, which, as we narrowed it down, as we looked at these a little more closely, these are probably the most applicable across the region. So again, the take home from this is really, there's some of these sites all over the region, and that really would be valuable for a developer to take a look at. And then we delved into the existing sort of real estate market, the individual industrial sites that are for sale as we speak. Now, this changes all the time, and what you see here, probably we concluded at the end of March or into April, so it's changed somewhat. But the point of this, are there suitable either greenfield sites or existing empty manufacturing facilities that could be redeveloped for this industry? And the answer is yes. And here's a good geographic distribution of showing them all over the region. And this doesn't mean that this is everyone that's potentially available, but it gives you a sense that they're out there and potentially available and really for sale as we speak. Whereas the initial map that I showed you didn't show that. And then lastly, we took a look at the existing forest products manufacturing mill sites, right? This is where something is going on today, because a key in any work that would be going on for economic development in the region to expand the industry would be to work with the manufacturers on these sites to find out what it would take to expand production. Much less expensive and much more production and efficient to work with an existing mill to, say, add a third shift, or to expand their facility to add more manufacturing at that facility than it is to build a brand new greenfield site. Not to say that that's not going to happen or that we don't want it to happen, but even for a lot of those low-grade products that we talked about, a lot of them could be co-located at these sites. So there's tremendous opportunity in an additional list of real estate sites where we could see expansion. And that's a good point to all of that. And so the conclusion is probably obvious from what I've said so far, and that is that suitable real estate available for expansion and for new manufacturing is not a limiting factor for economic development effort in the region. It doesn't mean that sites aren't expensive and that capital needs to be brought to bear, and it might be very expensive to do that, but there are sites out there that could be used for this purpose. And so really that's the end of the conclusion on the last report, report 5, which we've labeled report Roman 5. And so we can probably pick up on any questions we didn't get to, Joe.
Thank you, Charlie. And as Charlie said, what he has presented is just kind of the short version of a lot of really good work and material, which again, you all received the link to the full reports with your registration, and we'll circulate that again afterwards. We do have kind of a collection of questions here, Charlie, but one I think is great to kind of talk about where this work goes next is from Peter Corey, wondering about, if I represent one of these emerging industries, who do I talk to in order to advance, this project? And my own comment on that would be that I think a key audience for this material, from the start, is economic development entities. And we have some of those joining us today, which is fantastic. But I think from where I sit, there's always a need to kind of expand the knowledge that those of us who work in the forest sector or are familiar with it have into the economic development community, the state business attraction and retention agencies, local economic development districts, and planning commissions. So at least from the Northern Forest Center's vantage point, making sure we get this good information into the hands of people like Peter and others is really important. But Charlie, could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned it at the top of the meeting, but I think what NEFA has in mind in terms of what you'd like to be able to do with the next phase of this work?
You bet. Yeah, thanks for asking the question. And as I said up front, really, and I didn't say this, but in 2017, there was a meeting of industry folks, economic development folks from the states. Joe was at the meeting where we really kind of started to say these 3 states in particular, because Maine was going on its own with its For Maine effort, needed to be thinking about doing work to try to expand markets, particularly low grade. And ever since then, the Northeast State Foresters Association has been trying to raise funds to do really a full suite of work that the For Maine effort has been able to capitalize. And so there's still interest in getting substantial funding to take the work that you just heard about and take it to the next level, which ultimately is this. And this is what they've done in Maine. And that is they've hired an international forest products marketing kind of firm, economic development firm, to help them try to find leads to bring leads and potential developers to the state of Maine to capitalize on their strengths. And we need to do that in this 3-state region. So we're looking for funding to do a similar thing. However, ultimately, if that happens, it would be in partnership with the existing economic development agencies, as Joe mentioned, that are part of state government in the 3 states. And so if we don't find funding, and we've struck out a number of times, amazingly, in trying to find funding to take it to the next level, we're hoping that we can work with the economic development infrastructure that exists today with the information that we've got here that you heard about today to try to take it to the next level. So if you're somebody who has capital or interest in expanding an existing facility today, or in siting a new facility, certainly call me up. We have got connections in all of these areas, and talk to Joe. But your first stop shopping is the economic development infrastructure within the states, and in some of the states, especially New York, it's at more of a regional level, and drill down to the economic development professionals that are out there to help you take the next step. And so there are many avenues. We hope to take this further, but there are places you can go now because we have an infrastructure. But as Joe said, not to say that it's a weakness, but our experience has been that the economic development infrastructure in the 3-state region, they need the kind of information we just went through in these reports. They don't have this kind of information to help them drill down and understand where the opportunities are in this sector. And so hopefully this can be used that way, and to encourage entrepreneurs and those willing to bring capital to expand and look for new development. So hopefully that talks around that to give you somewhat of an answer where to go from there.
Thanks, Charlie. And yeah, Peter, to your question specifically, as Charlie said, you can certainly get in touch with him or with me through our work, as I mentioned, through this Future Forest Economy Initiative, trying to place funds into projects, specifically getting as close as we can to the private sector, into projects that build markets for wood and wood products. We've developed some knowledge about where you might start. And as Charlie said, the infrastructure across the states, I would say, varies in terms of that business development assistance. All right, Charlie, I'm going to try to kind of group our remaining questions here by kind of in order of the segments that you went through. And I will say to folks, if we don't get to your question before 1:30, we will follow up to try to get you that answer. So from the first section, you made a point, Charlie, about the relationship between forest management and carbon sequestration and storage rates. And there's a question, if you could just repeat or clarify how those two relate.
Sure, excellent question. And we actually have another project that the Northeast State Foresters Association was able to get some USDA Forest Service funding on, that we're about to start in the 7-state region. So that's New York and in the 6 states of New England, that is going to be trying to get this kind of information out to landowners about securing carbon in the region, because our forest is such an integral part of the solution for climate change issues. So the long and short is this: think about forest carbon in 2 ways. We certainly have a substantial inventory of carbon that's standing, or supply of it, if you will, that's standing in the forests of the region, right? And because the carbon is in the trees there, it's not in the atmosphere, and that's going to help our climate situation. But that all that's in the trees today has happened in the past. And our efforts towards trying to address the rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere are really looking to today and into the future. So number one, with what's existing, we want to make sure that we don't lose all that carbon to the atmosphere. And, we will admit electricity generation and also using wood to heat buildings in the thermal sector does release that carbon, but it's in the green cycle. It's always been in the carbon cycle, and that carbon will be taken up by trees, different than if you're using in the geologic carbon cycle, which is where fossil fuels come from. But the big important thing is really around sequestration today and in the future, right? How can we get more the forests of the region to take more CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it into trees that hopefully can go into long-lived products so that it doesn't get back into the atmosphere and helps our carbon equation for the climate change issue. And so we know how to do that from a forestry standpoint. Now, what's happened is there is a market for forest carbon, a real market where landowners get paid. To date, that has really been largely for large owners, really 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 acres and up have, and many landowners in the larger categories in the hundreds of thousands of acres have already taken advantage of those markets. And I'll tell you, they've sold carbon for 100 years on their property. And so it limits what they can do, but there are ways to sell carbon like that and also continue to harvest timber for the forest products industry. And so those owners that have done that are doing both. They've just got a new regime of what they're harvesting and how much they're harvesting that allows them to do that. And so the markets out there are one way to secure the carbon. But improved forest management, or management that looks carefully at carbon, can in fact increase sequestration. Here's an important thing, and I see information out there all the time that's not true. People will tell you that large, big trees are what you need for addressing climate change. And for storage, right, this thing I talked about, what's happened in the past, a big tree stores a tremendous amount of carbon, but compared to a small tree that's standing right next to it. But that's the wrong issue. The issue is over the landscape, what kind of forest sequesters the most carbon today and into the future? And that's actually a mid-successional forest. Think about a forest that has trees that are on average, say from 10 to 15 inches in diameter at breast height. That's the size forest in the region that is sequestering the most carbon today. An old growth forest is wonderful for all kinds of human values, but it's not the forest that is sequestering the most carbon over the area of the forest today. That is that mid-successional forest, right? So we do know these things. We do know how to encourage through management techniques, how to sequester more carbon. And this effort that we're just about to start, we'll be getting that information out to landowners. And if you want to be on an email stream around that project, just give me your email address and we'll add you. We're about to start that project. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. And yeah, this is a very dynamic space. I mean, just a couple of days ago, there was an article on the Wall Street Journal about JP Morgan buying Campbell Global, a TIMO, in part, so that they can offer carbon benefits from the forest to some of their institutional investors. So as your answer indicated, there's a lot of complexity here and it's moving pretty quickly. All right, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can here before 1:30. Just some data questions, Charlie. Did the New York forest inventory numbers include the forest preserve? And if so, is there a change if you remove that from the tallies?
Yeah, so anything that is off limits to timber harvesting in forests in the US is taken off the table for the FIA data. So in order to account for that in these numbers, we would have to add it in, and we won't do that because, because of the state constitution, we're not going to be cutting those trees. So they're not included in any of this. And that goes for wilderness areas in the national forests, because there are some in the region, and anything else that is restricted by regulation or law is not part of the numbers that you saw. So, there's more timber volume that's out there as a result, but it's not going to be available for this industry.
Great. And into some of the infrastructure questions, there's a question from Andy Perchlik about what about rail infrastructure for transporting biomass? Any factors that are different there from what you described for the broader region? Again,
the problem is the lack of Class 1 rail in the region. Other places, as I said, other places in the country, and if you remember that map, right, you could think about over to the Lake States, down the Appalachians, into the South, there's a lot more Class 1 rail. And so in those areas where the rail's in the right place for a particular manufacturing facility or what have you, they might be able to piggyback by getting a train, for biomass at a cost that they can afford. In this part of the world, trying to use the rail system just doesn't work because the cost is exorbitant, and putting the truck on the road is going to be less expensive. That's the issue. We don't have this Class 1 rail, which is focused on other products on which the timber industry can piggyback. And we're not going to, because we're not going to change what is the focus of the economy of this region, certainly not in our lifetimes.
Thanks. So next question, and I think you speak a bit to this in your benchmarking work. What about raw material, wood costs compared to other regions? How do Vermont, New York, and New Hampshire stack up?
Yeah, we do talk about some of that in the benchmarking work. And, compared to the benchmark states that we talked about, the costs are not that different. Because the benchmark states essentially are growing species that are similar, or even the same species of trees of timber that are growing in the three states, that's why we use those. If we went farther south, in the deep south, where there are the southern pine plantations, the wood cost per unit there is, I guess I could use the word, substantially less per unit than it is in the Northeast. It's well known within the industry as a whole that that's the case. But compared to the benchmark states, not a whole lot different in the way of prices. And we did benchmark that as part of our analysis. But that's a really good question. So compared to the benchmark states, if those are truly the states where we would compete on here, price of timber shouldn't be an issue. Because the price is based on a number of things, and it's not just the amount of supply that you have, but it's that infrastructure. And because we still have a substantial supply chain infrastructure in this part of the region, our prices are comparable to what they have. In fact, we have a more robust infrastructure to a lot of what you would see in those benchmark states.
Thanks. So two energy questions that I'm going to put together, given what you noted about particularly high electricity costs in the region. One is, given those high costs and the fiber available, can a business overcome high electricity costs by generating their own? And second, different but also related, what about is access to pipeline natural gas holding steady or declining or growing in the region?
Yeah, so whoever asked the question knows about energy if they asked about pipeline natural gas. So, what's driving the electricity generation sector in the whole region is natural gas. That's kind of the leader, and everything follows what's going on in that sector. That wasn't the case 40 years ago, but it is today. So, number one, I will say that many existing mills are going to self-generation. We've got examples of new combined heat power plants using wood chips that are either residuals from the plant where the manufacturing occurs, or material that's purchased as a way to reduce their costs. They tend to be areas where there's not natural gas, which frankly, a lot of the rural areas in the region, but that's happening and it's growing. I can say with my company hat on, we're helping several companies as we speak who are looking to convert from purchasing electricity off the transmission line from the utility to self-generation. So a lot more, we're going to see a lot more of that as a way to reduce power costs. But in terms of natural gas and its reach, we know where it is now. Is it growing in geography? Not a great deal. And you can understand it simply in a similar vein for what we talked about for broadband and cell coverage, right? If you've got few customers in a rural area, why would you spend substantial capital investment for infrastructure expansion if you're not going to have a lot of customers? And that goes for natural gas pipelines as well. So where we're seeing expansion, it's in the urban areas, and that's not where this industry largely exists. And so we're probably not going to see a lot of new opportunity for natural gas where it doesn't exist now, where the industry is largely located. Good question.
All right, and we'll wrap up with this one from Charlie Hancock, looking at those maps of potential redevelopment sites that you identified. To what degree do you think those existing sites have existing infrastructure that could be modified or altered versus developed new? Did you get to that level of
No, that's a good question. Doing what we did took a lot more time than we thought. And so, I mean, literally on all those sites, we did Google searches. We did not visit the sites, and we did not find the owners. So if you're going to take it to the next level, that's what needs to happen. And so just knowing that they're out there is step one. And so, if a potential industry wants to look at that data set to potentially expand in a site for redevelopment, they're going to have to take that to the next step, to be able to understand what's there and whether it's even truly available, even though nothing is built on there now, whether that's advantageous over and above buying a greenfield site that's already zoned for industrial zoning. New York does a particularly good job of identifying those sites and getting them pre-permitted. It may be cheaper simply to do that rather than to start from scratch at one of these sites, or it may be advantageous to simply purchase an existing empty large industrial building on an industrial zone site and locating forest products manufacturing facility in that facility. You know what I mean? So it's going to be kind of a case by case basis. But so, our intent was not to say, here's the database definitively, you can use this. It's saying, it appears that there's a robust opportunity out there for real estate. You got to dig down deeper and work with those that have this to take it to the next level. But that's also a really good question.
Thank you, Charlie. So there are a few questions we haven't gotten to, but we do want to wrap up to stay on schedule. So we'll make sure we get to those folks offline. But I just want to say in conclusion, I think big takeaways from this are clearly there's a lot of opportunity in this region, in this sector for growth. And I think these reports are also fairly clear-eyed in identifying some of the barriers that need to be addressed as well. And I think both of those, understanding both of those facets is really important to business attraction. We want to be able to talk about the opportunity and the assets in place, but also know what are some of the things that we need to address to make this region more appealing. So in wrap up, Charlie, I want to thank you and your colleagues for all of your tremendous work on this project. And by extension, that's the members of NEFA and the state forest utilization folks, Andy Fast, Paul Frederick, and Jason Drobnak. I want to thank the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities. A number of their folks are on the call for their support of this work, both in this region and nationally. And then finally, the U.S. Economic Development Administration for the funding. As we've said, the links to this PowerPoint, the reports themselves, and the recording, as soon as we can get it online, will be shared with all of you and available through the Northern Forest Center website. So look for that, and we encourage you to share, distribute these materials. Again, particularly in the economic development community, where people may know generally that there's an opportunity, but could benefit from understanding that there's some resources out there specific to the forest product sectors to support them. So again, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us. Thank you, Charlie. And
my pleasure.
Enjoy summer in the Northern Forest. Thanks, everyone.